In England, for example, in 1924, a great empire exhibition was held at Wembley. The King and Queen twice went to see it. It seemed to suggest that nothing had really changed, that peace and confidence had returned after victory. England's monarchy and institutions seemed untroubled. The economy was at last showing signs of recovery, and the empire was intact, and even a little larger than in 1914. The King Emperor's viceroy still ruled in India. The greatest imperial possession of all, the Raj, still looked as solid as ever. In the 1920s, the European masters could still behave as if nothing had changed in the imperial world. But a shadow was falling across the Asian empires, and it grew harder and harder to ignore. Japan had come a long way since the Meiji Revolution brought back the emperor to the center of her political life and launched her on the process of modernization. The coronation procession in 1928 of the Son of Heaven had a thoroughly European appearance. In 1904, she had been the first Asian state to launch and then to win a major war against a European power, Russia. That had been a landmark in the process by which she became a great power. The Great War had given her new freedoms to pursue that road. The economic demands of the Allies accelerated her industrial growth. It created a modern arms industry. Meanwhile, the waning of Western power in Asia gave her greater opportunity to use her own new strength. Japan had been the first non-Western power successfully to adopt the dangerous gifts of the West. With armed forces modeled on those of Western countries, she followed the earlier European examples, using them increasingly to bully and intimidate her Asian neighbor, China. Paradoxically, even as Western ideas were spreading in Asia, those ideas seemed to be losing ground faster than ever in Europe, the old heartland of the West. One symptom of this was the sudden runaway success of a book published at the end of the Great War by a German schoolmaster, Oswald Spengler. The title of his turgid, confused, almost unreadable volumes had a dramatic simplicity: The Decline of the West. Even if, as seems likely, few people ever finished reading them, and fewer still understood what he was trying to say, his title caught a mood. It became a cliché, and so thousands of people bought and talked about his book. Much indeed seemed to be on the wane. Traditional religious observance, for example, increasingly abandoned by the intellectuals and educated, and never deeply rooted among the masses of the industrial cities. Under pressure from materialism and the spread of liberal ideas, Christianity, the heart of the Western cultural tradition, was increasingly on the defensive. And not only old religious and moral views, but traditional ways of looking at the physical world, too, were under attack. Scientists had been chipping away for decades at the old mechanistic view of the universe whose roots lay in Newton. Among the names of those who contributed to its demolition, probably the best known to laymen was that of Albert Einstein, but there were many others. What he and they brought about was the greatest transformation of science since the 17th century. The collapse of boundaries between its traditional departments, the discarding of general laws, the erosion of traditional distinctions between space and time, mass and energy. Few could understand what such changes meant, but they further unsettled the foundations of a culture. And in one way at least, they were soon to have a devastating practical outcome. And a New Zealand scientist, Lord Rutherford, had carried out the key experiments which revealed that the smallest units of matter, atoms, were systems of particles, the foundation of nuclear physics.
And on this occasion, I wish to say a few words on the methods and ideas employed to break up atoms.
Some scientists had a more immediate impact on the lay public.
The old Greek.
Sigmund Freud, for example, whose ideas, understood correctly or not, were by the 1920s intellectual commonplaces. Those ideas crystallized a new mythology, one which would change men's minds about aggression, sex, guilt, moral responsibility. Somehow, during this century, ideas that had once been thought central to the Western tradition, key concepts and values, things regarded as a precious part of our heritage, seemed to lose their potency and their magic. They seemed to go sour, to go bad, produce untoward, unlooked for consequences. Take, for example, the spread of what we might call enlightened ideas. The spread of a belief in progress, in secularism, had been greeted with people who rejoiced as the boundaries of superstition and traditional religion were driven backwards. And yet, when they looked at the outcome, what seemed to have happened was that with those boundaries had been driven back also much of ordinary decent behavior, conventional morality, and even respect for one's fellow men. The new cities which had grown up, the literacy which had spread, didn't seem to have brought a new focus of civilization, but rather a kind of mass barbarism. And at a deeper level, many better educated Europeans found that they too were in the grip of the self-criticism they prized, yet turning to doubt the things which their civilization stood for. The self-criticism seemed to lead through self-doubt to intellectual self-destruction, so they began to undermine the values and the belief in rationality itself on which their civilization rested. You couldn't have really a more 19th century and perhaps even Victorian figure than Sigmund Freud, the greatest name in the history of the study of the mind. And yet, whatever he really and clinically achieved, what he is known for by many people who have not read a word of his books, is the destruction of the confidence which once was held in the rational, autonomous intellect. He somehow is believed to have left it caricatured almost as a puppet of the dark forces of the unconscious. Or take symptoms provided by the arts. In the 1920s, movements like Futurism, Surrealism, Dada seemed to take away any basis of understanding for the educated layman and patron who for centuries had upheld the traditional canons of art, aesthetics and craftsmanship in the West. They seemed to remove any sense of certainty about what was important, let alone what was beautiful in art. Perhaps to be undermining even the idea of art as an autonomous activity itself. And those forces of unreason and unrationality seemed, in public life, actually to run riot. In the 1920s and 30s, in politics and economics, all the roads that were going anywhere seemed to lead away from the traditional certitudes of liberalism.
Noi viceversa desideriamo e vogliamo la vittoria di Franco.
A new phenomenon, the emergence of dictators who appealed to an authority derived from the masses or from the nation, was the best political evidence of that. The first to make his mark was Mussolini, whose movement gave currency to a new political term, fascism. He benefited from the fear of communism felt by a weak and disturbed post-war Italy and by a thwarted nationalism. And those forces were among those which brought to power in Germany another, much more dangerous man. In 1933, Hitler became Chancellor, and so opened 12 terrible years for Germany and Europe.
Ich bin aus euch selbst herausgewachsen.
Hitler was, in a way, a political genius. He was a great demagogue. His insight into his audience's emotional needs carried him to power. With that power, he revolutionized Germany.
Nicht die intellektuellen Schichten haben mir den Mut gegeben, dieses gigantische Werk zu beginnen, sondern das kann ich sagen, den Mut habe ich nur gefasst, weil ich zwei Schichten kannte, den Bauer und den deutschen Arbeiter.
His stock in trade was an abusive nationalism laced with anti-Semitism. A new order, antithesis to all that civilized Europe had once stood for, emerged. Books which were seminal documents of European civilization, among them works by Freud and Einstein were cast into the flames. When Mussolini threw in his lot with Hitler, they talked of a crusade against communism. Soviet Russia, the citadel of communism, was still in the 1930s mysterious and largely unknown. What was clear was that she was undergoing a great upheaval. Central to it was a transformation of the countryside through the collectivization of agriculture, a brutal business costing millions of lives. That opened the way to the resumption of the march to industrialization begun under the Tsars. The man who presided over the revolution and over the terror which underpinned it was a new autocrat, Joseph Stalin. Under him, Russia was a totalitarian state such as Tsarist Russia had never been, and even Hitler's Germany never became. But Stalin mobilized Russia's resources as never before and exploited the fact for propaganda purposes. Foreign observers began to be impressed by heroic images of economic and engineering success. Enormous dams, like those which span the river Dnieper. Bountiful harvests in fields rich with grain. Dictators could window dress. They could hide failure. Democracies could not. And at the beginning of the 1930s, the greatest of the democracies, the United States, was lurching downwards into the same economic chaos which was to engulf democracy in many other countries. The 1920s had been prosperous. That made the early 1930s to the Americans all the worse. To many it was clear that the old liberal market economy had broken down irretrievably. But what could be put in its place? And how could Americans shake off the crippling psychological depression and sense of powerlessness which went with economic collapse? There emerged an answer given by Franklin Roosevelt, the most successful electoral politician the United States has ever produced, and perhaps the savior of American democracy. Roosevelt was rich, patrician, but he spoke to all men.
I see millions lacking the means to buy the products of farm and factory, and by their poverty denying work and productiveness to many other millions.
He offered confidence amid uncertainty, hope instead of despair. He dealt in words as much as in deeds, but the words were crucial.
In taking again the oath of office as President of the United States, I assume the solemn obligation of leading the American people forward along the road over which they have chosen to advance.
The New Deal launched an enormous public works program to revitalize the economy and absorb the unemployed. It was the setting of new departures in public enterprise. The political and institutional consequences were enormous. Roosevelt, in fact, gave American capitalism a new lease of life through the government it had long feared. The Roosevelt era surmounted America's gravest crisis since the Civil War, but it also marked a step in world history, for it offered the world a vision of a democratic alternative to fascism and communism, as answers to the problems of the 20th century West. Meanwhile, Europe spiraled downwards into war. This time, the fighting was to be embittered and savage as that of 1914-18 had never been. Men had grown more cynical. They were ready to use without scruple the new weapons of enormous destructive power which technology had put in their hands. It was soon clear that the habits of civilization were in retreat. Mass bombing, reprisals, swept away distinctions between civilians and combatants as ideology and desperation gripped men. Total war had arrived, and the war spread first to engulf all Europe and then beyond it. In 1941, Hitler turned east against Russia. Operation Barbarossa was named after a crusading German emperor of the Middle Ages. It was to confirm once more the old Russian dread of the enemy from the West. Soon after the invasion of Russia began, Roosevelt met Churchill. The leader of a nation at peace met the leader of a nation at war. But they spoke the same language in a document embodying their views on a post-war world, the Atlantic Charter. It spoke of the rights of all peoples to choose the form of government under which they will live. And there can be little doubt that such words reflected the hopes of many Americans and Englishmen. They were derived from the aspirations of Western liberal civilization. It was a clear sign of the way the war was turning ideological. Nazi behavior, Nazi brutality were giving the Allies a moral role, even if they hadn't wanted one. True, in 1941, the worst revelations were still to come. Nobody then dreamt about genocide. But they knew about torture, the ill treatment of civilian hostages, atrocities in the field. And there was another influence at work to make the war look more ideological, the blurring of differences and distinctions between the Allies if they were to act effectively together. They were all willing to share the same simplifying slogans and mythologies, to gloss over difficulties which would have been dangerous if exposed to the light. Britain, for example, had really to put almost everything aside in order to keep Russia from defeat and to retain the goodwill and economic support of the Americans until they entered the war. The confusions and the false hopes to which that simplification gave rise were to haunt the post-war decade. But nobody could have anticipated that on the day when Roosevelt and Churchill met on that British battleship. At the end of that year, Hitler declared war on the United States. That decision made him the ally of Japan. Japan had just made her final throw for dominion in the Far East by attacking British and American possessions and forces there and in the Pacific. By linking his cause to that of Japan, Hitler had again decisively affected Europe's fate. For without this decision, American power might have been kept only for the Pacific. Within a few months, the Japanese destroyed the colonial empires in the Far East. They drove the Americans from the Philippines. The British were overwhelmed in Hong Kong and then driven from the Malayan Peninsula. French Indochina was occupied by the Japanese. Dutch Indonesia was conquered. These were grievous blows to Europe's old Asian supremacy. When the fortress of Singapore surrendered to the Japanese, it was the most resounding disaster for British arms since Yorktown, the decisive defeat of the American War of Independence. 80,000 British and Commonwealth prisoners went into captivity. The Asians who witnessed that were not likely to forget such humiliation, and Axis propaganda made full use of it.
I never cared for you before, Hong Kong, Burma, Singapore. Bye, bye, empire. India I may lose too, then I only have the London Zoo. Bye, bye, empire.
Like the capture of Bataan and Corregidor, The Singapore victory was one of a series of outstanding successes in battle which shocked and surprised Western military leaders. Japan's successful use of technology, originally from the West, was one explanation of that amazing record of victory. But it also rested on a uniquely Japanese contribution. The discipline, hardihood and courage, as well as the cruelty and ruthlessness of the Japanese soldier, was rooted in a society still deeply respectful of the emperor's authority and the code of the samurai warrior. But in the end, American power was to prevail in the Far East as it was to do in Western Europe.
Allied countermeasures against Rundstedt's effort in the Ardennes had already gone a long way towards wiping out the salient when the town of La Roche was recaptured.
In 1944, the Allied armies in France were under American command. American economic strength sustained the Allied war effort. Roosevelt was increasingly concerning himself with European issues. The political future of Europe would not be decided by Europeans alone. When in 1945 the end came, the Russians were first in Berlin. The Red Army's colossal efforts against Germany had, almost by the way, given Russia direct control of more of Europe than the Tsars had ever known. Russian power now filled the space where once it had been balanced by Prussia and the old Habsburg Empire. So the armies of the superpowers met in the heart of the continent, the old heartland of Christendom. For the moment, they were allies, but they were to stay on there, even when they became rivals and near enemies. Europe was not merely physically devastated. Her political and economic structures were shattered. Apart from Russia and Great Britain and a handful of neutrals, not one of the nations of 1939 had escaped physical defeat. Worse still was the moral trauma she had undergone.
12 million murders. 2/3 of the Jews in Europe exterminated. More than 6 million of them on the killer's own figures. Murder conducted like some mass production industry in the gas chambers and the ovens of Auschwitz, Dachau, Treblinka, Buchenwald.
Horrible as the war had been, it was clear that one unambiguously good result had come of it: the overthrow of the Nazi regime. It became clear in 1945 that Churchill had spoken no more than the sober truth when he had told his countrymen that if we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, including all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age, made more sinister and perhaps more protracted by the lights of a perverted science.
That natural justice which demands that these crimes should not go unpunished.
The war in Europe had been, after all, a moral struggle, though no nation had gone to war for that reason. A new international organization, the United Nations, now came into being to replace the old League. It expressed a certain idealism, an optimism about a new international order.
First, we must bring into being an international civil service dedicated to the service of the United Nations.
But that optimism was to be short-lived. Almost at once, Russia seemed deliberately to seek to alarm her former allies, to isolate her own people and the peoples of Eastern Europe, to remake old nations. Communist governments were soon installed all over Eastern Europe. What the Americans, British and French understood by democracy disappeared. Once again, the two halves of the continent were to have divergent destinies. Once again, a dividing line appeared across Europe. And this time, from Trieste to the Baltic, it was marked by barbed wire, mines, watchtowers. To the east of it lay states, all of which had communist governments. The Red Army had, in fact, proved a far better instrument for the spread of international communism than proletarian revolution. On On the other side of the line, Western Europe recovered. American economic help came through the Marshall Plan, and American military protection safeguarded the recovery. The United States, legally one of the occupying powers of divided Germany, installed a garrison in the heart of Europe. And in the Far East, too, the United States shouldered new and unprecedented responsibilities. Despite the efforts of Japan's soldiers and sailors, she had been, in the end, defeated. First, superior air and sea power had mastered her. Then, she had been almost symbolically struck down by the first atom bombs by the science and technology of the West.
It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past, a world founded upon faith and understanding, a world dedicated to the dignity of man and the fulfillment of his most cherished wish for freedom, tolerance, and justice.
In fact, surrender had only been possible for the Japanese because the emperor ordered it. At a crucial moment of their history, the traditional, unquestioning obedience shown to him had been decisive. And that was to make possible another future for Japan, a future in which she would first be occupied by the victors and receive a new democratic regime from the hands of her conquerors. The aim was to be a new style Japan, a liberal, democratic, industrial society, further westernization, in fact. Yet, in places like Corregidor, the fortress island in Manila Bay, where for 100 days an isolated American and Filipino garrison had held out against the Japanese in 1942, there was the evidence of the fragility of Western power and of its limits if sufficient energy and force were mobilized against it. New nationalist movements existed in many former colonial territories. They would not welcome back the old masters. In India, the British showed that they had drawn the obvious conclusion. They pulled out in 1947. Some, the French for example, took longer. In Indochina, they were willing for a time to fight. But it did not take very long, in historical perspective, for the same result. 15 years after 1945, the Western empires in Indochina, Malaysia, Indonesia, Burma, India had gone. The end of the empires was followed by another paradox. The United States was the oldest anti-colonial nation. She had been the patron of the new nationalisms of the post-war world. Yet, in the new circumstances of Cold War, Americans became, in communist and third world demonology, the new imperialists, training and patronizing the forces of their reactionary allies, attempting to stem the tide of history in the Far East. Tangled as the 1960s unrolled in the complexities of the fight with communism, the United States was sucked into a last tragic initiative. It was not, it was true, an attempt to preserve Western dominion in Asia, but it was an attempt to exert its will on the Asian mainland. And, though America was the strongest and greatest of powers, the attempt failed. The defeat which the Americans suffered showed again the limits to Western power. And for some people it marked, even if only in the Cold War sense of the word, yet another stage in the decline of the West. The Vietnam War is a painful memory to Americans, so painful indeed to some that they're still finding it quite hard to come to terms with it. One attempt to do so was the building here in Washington of this monument, a monument to the 58,000 American dead and missing in Vietnam, who are thus commemorated, as are the dead of American wars elsewhere. The names of those men are all on these tablets, but there's nothing else. There's no inscription which might be thought to pass a political judgment on that war, because too many Americans are still uneasy about the reason for all that bloodshed. The Vietnam struggle quickly lost, indeed, if it ever had, that unquestioned moral acceptability which a war has to have if it's to be fought successfully by a democracy. Too many Americans felt that it couldn't be won at a price that they were willing or ought to pay. And so the United States, the greatest power on earth, was unable to generate the will to victory. Here, too, it's not difficult to believe that the American withdrawal from Vietnam came at the end of another long story, of which it was perhaps a part. The story of the long rolling in for decades of the waves of doubt which had beaten down on traditional Western culture and mythology. Waves of doubt which had worn away the belief in reason, belief in traditional religion and values, the belief in civilization itself, belief in a capacity to make judgments about other cultures. And then, of course, after 1914, had come the shattering events of the two great European civil wars, which had blown away the old belief in prosperity, in peace, in tolerance and liberalism as the normal state of affairs. And finally, the empires had crumbled away. It wasn't what Oswald Spengler had in mind when he chose the title for his book, The Decline of the West. But that phrase certainly had a terrible, plausible ring about it 60 years after its publication.
And yet perhaps there is one more thing to say. The view from inside the West can seem very gloomy, but what does a different standpoint reveal? One based, for instance, in Japan. For years now, her prosperity has certainly suggested to many people in the West that at least in the economic sense they're falling behind in a race which for a long time they led. It was only in 1951 that Japan launched the first ship built in her yards for export. 20 years later, she was the largest shipbuilding country in the world. And as her absorption of raw materials and energy shot up, so her domestic market flowered. New industries appeared, and in some of them, Japan now leads the world. Have the Japanese, in fact, beaten the West at its own game by being Japanese or by imitation, by becoming Western? However much Japan now looks like a Western nation, the roots of her transformation certainly go back into her history and culture. International attitudes deeply favorable to the emergence of a skilled, disciplined workforce. Japanese business rests on much that is emphatically not from the West. Close-knit hierarchies, company paternalism, the docility of labor, even if kimonos have been given up in offices and factories. The symbols are hard to read, ambiguous. Japan is democratic, with a democratic system of elections, but Japanese wear their politics with a difference. Canvassing for votes in Japan is obviously not quite what it is in England or the United States. It may be too soon to try to disentangle just what has happened to Japan's culture and tradition, faced by the subtle messages of emancipation carried by new consumer goods in the media. And yet, whether Japanese girls play softball because it was the game of the conquering and occupying power, or because it is simply part of a whole kit of activities which go with consumer society, it is, at any rate, not a traditional Japanese activity. Adopting Western clothes with their messages of Western informality also signals a move away from tradition. It's a matter of an international style, a part